I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by.
Past videos have shown how prophetic Old Testament references to the sea and to its waves constitute allusions to faithless humanity, blown about by whatever wind of philosophy is prevalent, driven by any number of beliefs, cultural trends, or common notions, which man might, during any given period of time, generally accept. And this is the world, the confused sea, the tendency of which is to reveal the sin underlying its nature. But this is not how the Church of Jesus Christ is to be. That which has been founded upon a rock should not be subject to the diverse philosophies of men. And therefore Paul writes, that we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men, and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Therefore the Church, as those who have received the gospel of God, which is the truth of Jesus Christ, well, they have a fixed hope, a certainty by which to guide their course in the world, a star by which to fix their course within this otherwise turbulent world. Continuity in this course assures a continuity of God's Spirit as a propelling force. Well, how do we know this? Well, consider this verse. And so is also the Holy Ghost, whom God hath given to them that obey him. We receive God's Spirit vicariously through faith in Jesus Christ, but we continue in his Spirit by obedience to that truth and to his commandments. For this purpose, God will place a sure object before us to guide our way. Not only are we given doctrine by which to orient our mind and commandments by which to direct our steps, but we are promised a model of God's perfection that we might emulate. In his time, God will provide us with the spiritual revelation of his holy nature, which is the image of Christ. An image shall be presented to our spiritual man. And this Isaiah prophesies, thine eyes shall see the King in his beauty. They shall behold the land that is very far off. And here is the objective of the Spirit's transformational power. And so, with our course steady upon this star that is fixed in heaven by God, along with the Holy Spirit flowing to us by our constancy therein, we shall reach the destination of a resurrection into the age to come. But we are also taught that there is a spirit called Antichrist, that we are to be constantly aware of, mindful it is deadly as to our future hope. And so John writes, and every spirit that confesses not that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is not of God. And this is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. The spirit of Antichrist makes a confession, but the confession is the lie foretold in John's epistles. This is the spirit that rides upon an express or implicit denial of the person or work of Jesus Christ. And if the conditions are right, via a concerted effort to bring false philosophy, and that philosophy is accepted, well, then it may also be empowered. That is, a counterfeit dynamic that carries the same elements as did the gospel. It comes with doctrine by which to orient men into a unity of mind. It will carry demonstration of power, confirmatory to that doctrine, and a model attractive to the fallen mind of carnal man. This will be on display to be emulated unto conformity therewith. And many who profess Christ are falling prey to the deluding spirit of this age, because they do not hold as sacred and inviolable that work which God has performed and borne witness of. This video constitutes an explicit warning against the stirrings of the spirit of Antichrist, which is becoming increasingly a prevailing wind, gusting upon the sea of humanity, as the dragon prepares his apostate doctrine, his deceptive course, his deluding spirit, his counterfeit star. While there are a good many agents of Antichrist present, well, this video will focus upon one of the more recent to attain worldwide acclaim as a formulator of poisonous teaching, teaching that is proving especially deceptive and a snare for professors of Jesus Christ. An intellectual star, whom at first glance appears a defender of the Christian tradition, but who quotes atheistic philosophers as readily as he quotes Jesus Christ, who teaches New Age mysticism under the guise of an academician, and who is proving capable of drawing followers from a broad political spectrum and directing their course upon the path that leads to destruction.
All I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer by. You could feel the wind at your back in those days. The sounds of the sea.
And what is it that makes one man an exceptional leader? We see here indications that it is his negative side which makes him strong. That his evil side, if you will, properly controlled and disciplined, is vital to his strength.
So you have to develop your inner monster a little bit. And then that makes you a better person, not a worse person. It's weird. It's weird, but that's just how it is. Outside of that diagram is chaos itself, and that's the chaos from which things emerge. Now, it's the source of all things, but it's also the terrible predator, the terrible eternal predator that lurks beyond the explored domain. It's a winged dragon, and it's winged, who knows why. Matter and spirit, that's partly what it is, and I'll explain that later. It's also potentially the predatory beast that's been after us for forever, and the winged predator that picked us up from the skies. You see this reflected in the Harry Potter idea, for example, that the reason that Harry Potter can withstand Voldemort is because he's got a piece of him, right? He's been touched by it, and the way that you keep the psychopaths at bay is to develop the inner psychopath so that you know one when you see one, right? And then, but that's a voluntary thing. So it's like a set of tools that you have at your disposal, which is full knowledge of evil. And that does, Nietzsche said, if you look into an abyss for too long, you risk having the abyss gaze back into you, right? The idea is that if you look at something monstrous, you have a tendency to turn into a monster. And people are often very afraid of looking at monstrous things exactly for that reason. And then the question is, well, should you turn into a monster? And the answer to that is, yes, you should. But you should do it voluntarily and not accidentally. And you should do it with the good in mind, rather than falling prey to it by possession, essentially, because that's the alternative. You know, it's sort of Jung's contention that we had an organic development of a metaphysical ethic that was embedded in religious tradition, and that basically unfolded, let's say, in the West till about 1600, 1500, something like that, and then science emerged and we got unbelievably technologically powerful. We're so technologically powerful, but we're still not very wise, and that just seems to me to be a bad combination. And I thought about that a lot. It's like, okay, well, how do you handle the combination of exceptional technological power and an impaired ethic, let's say, something like that, underdeveloped ethic, or one even in which you have no faith, because, you know, it seems the foundational elements of it are irrational. They're in mythology, they're in religion, they don't fit well with the scientific worldview. Certainly it was the problem that Jung was trying to address, there's no doubt about it. And along with that went an associated problem, which was, you know, what happened in the 20th century, which was so awful. And in so many places it was just so unbelievably brutal and terrible, and it was perpetrated by millions of people, and they were individual people, and they weren't that much different from normal people. In fact, they were normal people. And so the other thing that struck me was that it would be better if that sort of thing didn't happen anymore. And so I was trying to figure out what the hell could possibly be done about that. And you know, part of Jung's contention was, well, you had to understand yourself as a monster if you were ever going to maintain some control over the fact that you are in fact a monster.
But his insights have really shaped my understanding of the importance of Christ as a grounding, you know,
symbol for,
absolutely,
for that grounding symbol.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can look at it almost purely psychologically if you want.
Right.
You need a symbol of transcendent good.
Right. I tell people, you know, Christ should be someone we want to imitate whether we're religious or not.
Right.
He's the greatest man of history, right?
Well, it's the active imitation that is the religious element.
Right.
You know, and one of the advantages too of a transcendent ideal is that everyone bows to it, including the king.
Yeah.
Right. And this is something that's really necessary to understand from a psychological perspective, is that if there's no transcendent ideal, then the king is then it's the king.
Right.
Well, that's no good, because the king has to bow down to something too, and that gets abstracted up into something like the symbol. This is the symbol of the self that Jung talked about, that was associated with Christ. So, and that's the psychological idea, and it's a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
You're imitating the highest good, whatever that is. And it's something like the willingness to voluntarily sacrifice yourself to the good. It's something like that. I mean, it's the first thing you have to understand with regards to trying to come to terms with the conception of the shadow is to understand the idea of persona. Persona is the you that you present when you want people to accept and like you. Often like. Let's say that you go to a party and you're trying to impress the people that are there, and you're trying to get them to like you. And so you maybe get jabbed at a little bit and you laugh, and you know, you go along with everyone so that they like you, and then you go home and you're bitterly resentful about the way that you were put down at this party. And that's going to make all sorts of aggressive, I wish I could have said, it's going to make all sorts of aggressive and vengeful thoughts sort of flash through your imagination. Well, the first part of the problem is that you were too much persona, right? You sacrificed yourself in some sense at the party so that people would like you. And in the second part, you're refusing to admit to the existence of those elements of you that would have actually protected you from doing that. Go home and you're all bitter and resentful and you have fantasies of revenge. I mean, that reveals to you the shadow part of you that's aggressive. And the thing is, you actually need that, because if you would have integrated that more successfully into your personality, when you went to the party, you wouldn't have had to let people put you down to get them to like you. You know, instead of having a face like this, which says, I'll take anything that's coming my way, you know, you have a face and a stance that's more determined and assertive. And if you manifest that properly, people aren't going to mess with you to begin with. But, you know, you may have already adopted a morality that says, well, I have to be likable, and I shouldn't do anything that causes any conflict, and I shouldn't ever, you know, hurt anybody's feelings. And so you're just to present yourself as a punching bag, and you think that that makes you a good person, but it doesn't. And there's no integration of the shadow in that situation. Right? You can't stand up for yourself properly. And in order to do that, you have to grow some teeth and be willing to use them. And again, that's something that might violate your morality, because you might say, well, I shouldn't be able to bite people. And the thing is, yes, you should be able to bite people hard. And if you're able to bite them, then generally you don't have to. But if you run into people who only have boundaries because other people impose them on them and you won't do it, you're going to be the bullied one in the office, for example. You're not going to get a raise. People aren't going to credit you with your own work. Other people are going to take credit for it. You know, and you're going to go home angry because you're doing your best and you're trying to get along with everyone and nothing ever goes your way. Well, it's because you're a pushover. And you think that's good because you confuse harmlessness with morality. It's not right. Just because you can't do any damage doesn't mean you're moral. It just means you don't have the capability for mayhem. And that makes you a pushover. I mean, the Jungian stuff is very, very dark, you know. It's very dark because his notion of what constitutes a moral human being is much different from the typical view. He really thinks you get that horrible side of yourself integrated so it's up there where you can use it.
Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in a quiet village in the eastern part of Germany, where his father was the priest. His philosophy was full of heroism and grandeur. He was a prophet of what he called Selbstüberwindung, or self-overcoming, the process by which a great-souled person, what he called an Ubermensch, rises above their circumstances and difficulties to embrace whatever life throws at them. He wanted his work to teach us, as he put it, how to become who we really are. His thought centres around 4 main recommendations. 1. Own up to envy. Envy is, Nietzsche recognised, a big part of life. Yet the lingering effects of Christianity generally teach us to feel ashamed of our envious feelings. They seem an indication of evil, so we hide them from ourselves and others. Yet there's nothing wrong with envy, maintained Nietzsche, so long as we use it as a guide to what we really want. Every person who makes us envious should be seen as an indication of what we could one day become. The envy-inducing writer, tycoon, or chef is hinting at who you are capable of one day being. 2. Don't be a Christian. Nietzsche had some extreme things to say about Christianity. In the entire New Testament, he wrote, there is only one person worth respecting, Pilate, the Roman governor. It was knockabout stuff, but his true target was more subtle and more interesting. He resented Christianity for protecting people from their envy. Christianity had, in Nietzsche's account, emerged in the late Roman Empire, in the minds of timid slaves who'd lacked the stomach to get hold of what they really wanted, and so had clung to a philosophy that made a virtue of their cowardice. He called this Sklavenmoral. Christians, whom he rather rudely termed die Herde, the herd, had wished to enjoy the real ingredients of fulfillment, a position in the world, sex, intellectual mastery, creativity, but they'd been too inept to get them. They therefore fashioned a hypocritical creed, denouncing what they wanted but were too weak to fight for, while praising what they didn't want but happened to have. So, in the Christian value system, sexlessness turned into purity, weakness became goodness, submission to people one hates became obedience, and, in Nietzsche's phrase, not being able to take revenge turned into forgiveness. Christianity amounted to a giant machine for bitter denial. 3. Never drink alcohol. 4. God is dead. Nietzsche felt that the gap left by religion should ideally be filled by culture. He meant philosophy, art, music, literature. Culture should replace scripture. He called for a reformation in which people, newly conscious of the crisis brought on by the end of faith, would fill the gaps created by the disappearance of religion with philosophy and art.
Nietzsche announces the death of God in a famous aphorism in his book The Gay Science called The Madman. In this passage he tells a tale of a madman who runs out onto the street screeching, "I seek God, I seek God." Understandably, those on the street give him a strange look and continue on with their evening. However, the madman does not cease. He yells, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto." Despite the madman's attempt to enlighten his fellow citizens regarding the enormity of the death of God, the individuals on the street paid little attention to him. When he noticed the utter indifference of those around him, he threw his lantern on the ground so that it broke in pieces and was extinguished. "I have come too early," he said then. "My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men." In his book, The Gay Science, he wrote, "In fact, we philosophers and free spirits feel as if we are illumined by a new dawn on receiving the news that the old God is dead. Our hearts overflow with gratitude, wonder, premonition, anticipation. At last the horizon seems to us open again. The sea, our sea again lies open before us. Perhaps there has never yet been such an open sea." A universe without God or without a transcendent purpose driving the lives of men toward a common end was in fact a universe, according to Nietzsche, where strong and creative individuals could freely sculpt their own worldviews.
Nietzsche sees overcoming as an expression of the most fundamental motive force in life, the will to power. Power for Nietzsche can of course take obvious external forms, such as physical, economic, political, and military power. The process of overcoming mainly has to do with transcending our habitual ways of valuing, and hence transcending reality as we typically construe it in terms of our culture's dominant values. Nietzsche calls this process of transcending our already existing values a revaluation, or transvaluation, of all values. His entire body of work represents an attempt to bring it about, both for the reader and for the world more generally. In fact, Nietzsche proposes that a revaluation of values that runs deeply enough can eventually lead the entire human race beyond all that has defined it thus far, into a new pattern of life beyond the human. He calls this new possible form of life the Ubermensch, or overman. As he puts it bluntly, man is something that must be overcome. People sometimes argue that the character of Zarathustra is a kind of speculative illustration of what the Ubermensch might look like. However, Nietzsche claims that humanity is currently far closer to apes than to the Ubermensch. So perhaps it's best to treat the Ubermensch simply as a place marker for the next evolutionary stage beyond humanity as we've known it thus far.
Many scholars and philosophers who have been influenced by Nietzsche have claimed that in communicating the death of God to the masses, Nietzsche should be characterized as a modern-day prophet.
The concept of the Superman is one of the strangest, most fascinating ideas in philosophy. We find it coined by Friedrich Nietzsche in his book of 1883, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche points out that evolution cannot be assumed to have finished. Human beings have evolved from apes. Nietzsche's character Zarathustra's task is to speculate about what the Superman, the more advanced person of tomorrow, will be like. Suppose we were psychologically superior to people today, what would we be actually like? What is the ideal kind of human being? And he came up with a very surprising and challenging answer. Nietzsche's strategy for answering his own question was to identify the person he most admired, the person he thought had the best approach to life, and then home in on the qualities that made this person the way they were. He was particularly impressed by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whom he regarded as the nearest anyone had yet come to being a Superman. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe has often been seen as one of Europe's big cultural heroes. What impressed people at the time was how he lived his life, the kind of person he was. We can pick up some vital lessons from him. While he was working, Goethe fell in love with the fiancée of one of his colleagues. He then committed a huge indiscretion and wrote up the love affair as a novel. He called it The Sorrows of Young Werther. The central character, Werther, is a lightly disguised self-portrait. One of the most striking things about Goethe is how much he did, how broad his horizons were, and how wide his interests came to be. He explored this particularly through his most famous work, Faust. Goethe worked on Faust all his life. The earliest sketches go back to his teens, and he only decided he was done with it when he was in his early 80s. Faust is a medieval academic and scholar. He's very learned, but he doesn't do very much. He's unfulfilled in love, he hasn't made any money, and he has no power. His knowledge is sterile, his life feels pointless, and he wishes he could die. But then he is visited by a devil called Mephistopheles, who offers him boundless energy, good looks, and the ability to do whatever he wants. The question is, what will Faust want to do? The first danger for Faust is to just stay an academic who resists worldly impact. With the devil's help, he could be the ultimate bookworm. He could get his hands on the oldest, rarest manuscripts. But Faust gets weary of words and longs for action. Now the second danger is that he will use his new powers to gratify every sensual appetite. He might become just a pure hedonist. Faust goes some way down this path. He goes to a bar and gets everyone very drunk. He goes to a huge orgy. But then he realizes that what he really seeks is beauty and love, and this leads him on from sex and alcohol. The third danger is that Faust will become a confident but shallow political leader. But in the second part of the play, Faust pursues a grander purpose. Eventually, he organizes the development of a new country, somewhat reminiscent of the Dutch Republic, which at that time was the most enlightened and successful society in the world. Faust is a morality tale for all of us. He shows us both the pitfalls of life and how we might avoid them. Faust knows a great deal, but he resists being an academic. He loves sex, but he doesn't give way to debauchery. He likes power, but he doesn't use it for megalomania. He puts it to work in the service of noble ends. Faust's career path is not unlike Goethe's. Faust is essentially tracing for us a theory of how to live a full life. He's very interested in ideas, but not a scholar. He visits Italy, but he doesn't stay there. He goes back to work, he tries out administration, and learns how to wield power. But once he's mastered this side of himself, he moves on. The Faustian idea is that in order to develop fully, we have to flirt with things that are quite dangerous, but hold on to a sense of higher purpose. He was the last European to do a certain kind of remarkable things, to write great novels and plays, and also to play a significant role in science. His interests ranged through geology, meteorology, physiology, and chemistry, and his most important work was in botany. In 1790, he produced his study, The Metamorphosis of Plants, and a book on optics and colour called The Theory of Colours was published in 1810. As he aged, Goethe kept on working, and he kept on seeking love and sex. In his 70s, he fell in love with a woman called Ulrike. His passion was unrequited. He died at his house in Weimar in 1832, aged 83. We have so much to learn from him. We don't often hear people declaring a wish to be a little more like Goethe, but if we did, the world would definitely be a more vibrant and humane place. He also took some hints from Napoleon, Montaigne, Voltaire, and Julius Caesar. He concluded that supermen are going to have some wonderful and sometimes unexpected characteristics. They will make their own values. They'll be very independently minded. They won't ask, what do other people admire, and follow along. They'll carve their own path. Supermen accept that they might need to hurt people in the name of great things. They can be selfish in strategic ways. Greatness for them will be about the reform of humanity towards pagan values, the values of Goethe. Supermen will never be resentful of the success of others. They'll accept suffering as a necessary component of good things. They'll understand that they're hard to understand, and that therefore they may often be lonely. They'll be gentle towards the weak, out of consciousness of their own great strength. they'll be a little bit wicked around sex by conventional standards. They'll not be humble, but rather delight in their own abilities. They'll be interested in the practical application of culture to raise the mentality of society. That maybe being great involves some qualities that are a bit disturbing, and also that greatness means being interested in the salvation of mankind through culture. The word Superman is useful for getting us to think about who we would like to evolve into. Each of us should, under Nietzsche's guidance, have a sense of what we would like to be if we could be the super version of ourselves. The idea of the Superman helps us to refine our own ambitions.
So typical. Our intentions are good, but somehow we can't find in us to do what's right. And there was a light that was born 2,000 years ago, but it seems the world is in more darkness today than it ever has been. There's a reason for that. It isn't because people are naughty. There's a reason for it. Things are moving in God's timetable. It's going somewhere. In fact, what every person desires in his heart is a kingdom of love, joy, and peace. We try to find it in our own ways. But that's the way it's going. That's what's going to happen. Whether we're in it or not depends upon us. But in order for that kingdom to come to pass, and it shall, there's no power that can stop it. Not man nor devil can stop God. He knows exactly what he is doing. But it's predicated on, it's based on the development of this group of rulers. The nations just go on their way. Seems almost randomly things happen to them. They're born. So many people have died since we started this morning. Some of starvation, some of old age, some of sickness, some in accident, some in war. And it seems like something that no one could control. But the Bible says that God knows the stars by name. How much more people? How much more people? And way many more stars than there are people. Way more. But he knows them all by name. How much more people are created in his image? Does he know everyone's name? From the smallest child to the oldest person. So everything is very carefully defined. It's moving toward an end that's already been prophesied in the Bible, and there is no power that can stop it. What God is developing is a pattern that will bring what the Christmas message is supposed to be, but never accomplishes, is righteousness and peace and joy and love to the world. That's the promise of Christmas. And what I'm saying to you today is twofold. One, it's going to happen. It's on schedule. It's on time. It's not left up to man to do. God is doing it. Men lay their hand on it, but it comes to nothing because we're only dust. We're sinful and rebellious and ignorant, and we do the best we can. We can't bring in a kingdom into the world of righteousness, peace, and love. A lot of men have tried. A lot of the philosophers that developed communism, I'm sure this was in his mind, to bring in righteousness, love, joy, and peace. Karl Marx, when he wrote Das Kapital, he sure brought in a lot of righteousness, love, joy, and peace into Afghanistan, didn't he? Bombs that blow the fingers off children, but I'm sure that's what he had in mind. That's what American educational philosophers have had in mind. What they produce is a generation of cocaine and crystal users. You can't do it. We can't do it. Only God can do it. And so we say, well, that happened 2,000 years ago, and Jesus was murdered, and that's the end of it, and we all ought to try to do better. We should do better. But we can't. So it's as simple as that. And if you are one of those that God has called to be a part of the light that's coming and the light that's being formed, you'll understand what I'm saying. And the Spirit will speak it to you and make it real to you. And this is what you will do. Or turn your back on God, one or the other. But if you will be faithful to what God has given you, you'll lay down your life and you'll follow Jesus, knowing that this world is not your home. You are not called to live an ordinary life. You're called to live an extraordinary life. It's going to challenge you to the roots of your toenails, but the purpose is that other people might someday actually have, not talk about it and then wake up screaming at 4 o'clock in the morning on Christmas morning. Not this hopeless thing that never happened, but might actually have love, joy, and peace. And that's not possible until this body, this church, has been filled with Jesus and then can return with him and bring this to people. And that's what it's been about for 2,000 years. And that's why, with a message of love and joy and peace and happiness and goodwill, some have been burned at the stake and put in the arena at Rome. Where does that fit in? That's the church. That's the people who are paying the price so that one day the promise of Christmas can come to mankind. And I will give him the morning star. Now, what does that have to do with anything? The morning star is God's light. And a morning star, a day star, these mean the same thing. There's no difference. And the morning star is a planet. Often referred to, Venus is referred to sometimes as the day star. It's a planet which looks like a star just at the dawn of the day. And what God is saying here is that there's a new day coming. Thank God. There's a new day coming. There's a day that will be Christmas always. And as C.S. Lewis said, every chapter will be better than the one before. That's hard for us to have lived a battered life, to realize that one day these troubles and problems will actually be gone and God shall wipe away all tears. But it's true. It's true. A new day is coming.
Peterson promotes a perspective that is common to both the occult as well as to Christianity, which is that a breaking must occur before true progress can occur. In Christianity, this breaking is typified in the Day of Atonement. In prophecy, as the day of the Lord, and by Christ, as that travail leading to the new birth. Most aspects of the Christian faith seem to have a counterfeit in the occult, and as Jung was enamored in the Kundalini manifestations of Hinduism, and as many proponents of the New Age and occult mysticism advocate for the use of mind-expanding chemicals for contact with entities of another dimension or another place, so Mr. Peterson appears to promote mind-expanding chemicals as a means of pursuing his objective, although somewhat veiled for understandable reason.
In regards to the shamanic transformation is that people go through these terrible experiences, often drug-induced, by the way, with regards to the shaman. They usually use psychedelic chemicals of one form or another, often mushrooms, but they've come up with some very strange concoctions like ayahuasca down in the Amazon. And ayahuasca is an amazing substance. It's made out of the bark of one thing and another plant whose name I don't remember, that hardly even grow in the same place and that have to be cooked together in a special way, and no one has any idea how the damn Amazonians figured that out. Ayahuasca takes them apart, and it does that in part because it affects the serotonergic system very, very powerfully, like all psychedelics do, and it transports them to another world, and that's how they interpret it. But if you give people psilocybin and they have a mystical experience, which is very common among people who take these sorts of chemicals, then their personality transforms permanently, such that 1 year later they're 1 standard deviation higher in openness, and openness is the creativity dimension, and that seems to be a permanent transformation, and so that's really remarkable. And about 80% of the people who undergo the Johns Hopkins experiments report that the experience is like one of the 2 or 3 most important things that's ever happened to them. DMT, dimethyltryptamine, if I remember correctly, is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, and you produce it in your brain, and it's in plants. It's like a very common chemical, but DMT is a weird hallucinogen because it has an extraordinarily short mechanism of action. It's like, and people who take it report that they're blasted out of their body, like out of a cannon, and then they go out somewhere and encounter beings of various sorts, and then 10 minutes later they're back, and virtually everyone reports that, which is really strange. And so Strassman was giving people DMT intravenously so that the trip would last long. They all said the same thing, and he'd say, well, that was a dream, and they'd say, no, and it was the most real thing that ever happened to me. And he'd say, well, you know, it's an archetypal experience, and they'd say, no, that was no archetypal experience. I went somewhere else, and I saw things, and I'm back, and like, I don't care what you think. And like, who the hell knows, right? Because it's all subjective. But the weird thing about it is that everyone's reporting the same thing. How the hell do you account for that? And then the shaman, you know, when they take these psychedelic chemicals, they basically say the same thing. They say, well, first of all, it more or less killed me. That's this. You know, I dissolved to a skeleton, and then I climbed the tree that unites heaven and earth, and I went into the realm of the gods, and they gave me some information, and I'm back. It's like, okay, well, you know, we don't really know what to make of that, and certainly that's what Eliot describes when he describes the shamanic procession, not the shamanic initiation. And you know, there's dissolution to a skeleton first, and then like a death, a symbolic death, or experienced as an actual death, and then bang, up into the realm of the gods.
So you talked about Jung and how you should confront that which you don't want to confront the most, or you're most afraid of or disgusted by, that you have the most resistance to. But we were talking about psychedelics and the experience of hell. So at least some of the people I've talked to, they describe negative trips as an experience of constant fear, prolonged fear, and some of the most dramatic and personalized fear that they've ever experienced. So shouldn't negative psychedelic trips elicit the kind of confrontation that Jung thought you should engage in?
Could be. Could well be. You know, one of the things that the priests had to do before they communed with what was ever in the Ark of the Covenant was purify themselves. And so one possibility is that the bad psychedelic experience is a involuntary confrontation with what Jung would describe as the shadow. It's like, so beware of experimenting with substances that produce divine revelations. Future shamans among the Tungus, as they approach maturity, go through a hysterical or a hysteroid crisis, but sometimes their vocation manifests itself at an earlier age. The boy runs away into the mountains and remains there for a week or more, feeding on animals which he tears to pieces with his teeth. He returns to the village, filthy, blood-stained, and it's only after 10 or more days that have passed that he begins to babble incoherent words. The strange behavior of future shamans has not failed to attract the attention of scholars, and from the middle of the past century, several attempts have been made to explain the phenomena as a mental disorder. This is the critical issue. Those among them who had been ill become shamans precisely because they had succeeded in becoming cured. So it's not the descent into this strange subterranean psychological state that constitutes the transformation that makes the shaman, but it's the emergence back out of that. And that's a journey to the underworld and a rebirth, right? And he associates this to some degree with this shamanic tradition that both Freud and Jung in particular, underwent very intense periods of psychological disturbance, let's say. And I would say what was happening is that because they were questioning their axioms at the most fundamental level, they were deranging their cognitive and perceptual structures, right? And Jung was also experimenting with imaginative techniques, with visionary techniques, which he did a lot. And there was a period of his life where he was having a constant stream of visions, which he wrote down in a book called The Red Book. But at the same time, he was still functioning as a psychiatrist and operating normally in the world. And so, people have suggested that what he had was a psychotic break, but that's ridiculous because that's not how it works, man. If you're having a psychotic break, you're not being an effective psychiatrist. It's quite common for people of genius to go through an intense crisis, psychological crisis, but then resolve it, and the genius is in the resolution, right? The precondition for the genius is the dissolution in some sense, because you have to be obsessed with a problem. It has to grip you completely before you're going to concentrate on it so obsessively that you might come up with a solution. But it's the people who come up with a solution that are the prophets and the shaman and so forth and so on. And
The recent debate between celebrated professor of psychology Jordan Peterson and Channel 4 presenter Cathy Newman has captured the attention of millions, more specifically 4.7 million. A great deal of how viral it went has to do with just how one-sided it ended up being. At each and every turn, Dr. Peterson shrugged off from any "so you're sayings" and "what you mean is" with a charismatic smirk and a concise retort. By now, the many memes mocking her for those strawman reductions to absurdity have become as popular as the debate itself. For everyone watching, it couldn't be clearer what she was doing, and it's a marker of how emotionally committed to her point of view she is. In the echo chamber of British media and acceptable discourse, it is no doubt a shock to the system to hear someone with Peterson's academic credentials bluntly state the sort of things he does. Naturally, she tackled it in the only way she knew how, by disparaging his intentions, rather than the substance of what he is saying. She isn't speaking to Peterson the man, but rather the symbol he represents in the broader lens of her worldview. In the aftermath, her combative and dishonest approach has been widely mocked and repudiated.
12 rules for life. So without reading this, so what you're saying is, that's what I'd like to...
There's only 12 things you need to know in life, right? That's it?
Yeah. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome Dr. Jordan Peterson, a friend of mine, professor of psychology at University of Toronto, as well as a clinical psychologist and cultural critic. He's risen to media prominence, plus his biblical lectures are wildly popular.
Really one of the great interviews of all time. By the way, you should say Jordan Peterson has a new book out, 12 Rules for Life. That clip is everywhere. Jordan Peterson joins us tonight. It's an honor to have you.
I want you to look for the number of times in that one interview he triggers the interviewer into an actual hallucination. And you'll see him laughing every time it happens, because he recognizes it for what it is, as a hallucination.
I felt bad, but I was also laughing. I went to her Twitter page to read, with each one of her tweets, no matter what she says, someone writes underneath it, so what you're saying is, and then some ridiculous, but
Now, I have to say that I quite like Jordan Peterson.
I'm so thrilled at what's happening with Jordan Peterson.
He has a brand new book out, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. It is topping all of the bestseller charts right now, and it answers the question, what does everyone in the modern world need to know? It's a pretty big question that you seek to answer there, Jordan. What do you attribute that to? Why do you think it is that you went from somebody who's sort of the right-wing new even mid-last year to somebody who's now getting profiled in all of the biggest newspapers on planet Earth?
I would say debate, because he was just answering questions and she was lashing out against him, and he had arguments, but she didn't.
The incredible number of times she appeared to purposely misunderstand things he said and then mirror back at him some completely batshit insane version of his views.
You get a lot of people coming up to you and saying that you give them hope, that you have helped guide them in their life, that you've helped them make their life better.
One time after another, he would, like a surgeon with a scalpel, he was dismantling her belief system in front of her. It was like he was, disemboweling her psychology, without anesthesia.
Your book, Maps of Meaning, is certainly not an easy book. And yet they have this huge following. I mean, the biblical lectures have a very big following, which raises...
Yeah, among all sorts of people, among atheists too, and among Muslims as well, from what I've been understanding.
She is quite literally hallucinating in front of you, and he's triggering each one of these. They're all different, but he triggers them one at a time by having an argument that she can't refute, but also can't accept. That's the trigger for cognitive dissonance. And that's what triggers her one time after another. It's fascinating to watch.
Well, and I get letters from Orthodox Jews in Germany saying, they're really happy about the lectures. And I get letters from Orthodox priests in monasteries and like all religious people all over the world, regardless of denomination, saying, wow, we're really enjoying these biblical lectures. And I think, it's not so strange, but...
I mean, are men and women fellow travelers through life, or are we not? Are we as a society in this together, or are we not? If Peterson's message, the one that is so appealing to young men, is that you have a responsibility to be the best you can be and to find meaning and purpose in life, and that once you have your house in order, it's your responsibility to contribute something positive to the world and other people, and to reduce suffering where you see it. What he's saying is that we all have a duty to play fair, act kindly, foster understanding, speak the truth, or at least don't lie, and make a positive impact on those around us. His message is that it is our duty to take the gifts given to us by all of those men and women who have lived and died and suffered and struggled to bring us to this amazing, miraculous time and place, and not only appreciate and enjoy what they have given us, but to pay it forward. And if we all have this duty, then young women do too. They have a duty toward others, including men and boys.
Now, if you're a woman, that seems pretty unfair.
Only if you're a moron or uninformed.
And the reason I'm so upset by this interview is also because I recognize myself in her.
Keep on climbing!
I still consider myself a feminist, but that's another reason like why I use that word personally. I consider myself a feminist, but I was like her, which is basically an unreflected, all-believing feminist who's angry at everything, especially men and the patriarchy, who's outraged but has no grounds to base her beliefs on except what that ideology told her.
So I've watched you for a while. I've always thought you were a truth teller.
You're just saying these things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean, you are a provocateur.
I never said
You're like
anything.
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to.
Who's provoking the public here, Kathy? He says that sexism against women doesn't account for anywhere near the 9% variation in pay between men and women, and you seem almost upset that he would say it, because then, oh my God, people might believe it, and then what would happen, Kathy? If the pay gap is mostly due to men and women making choices that work for them based on their own preferences and priorities within a mostly fair system, then there'd be nothing for women to be angry about, would there? There'd be no reason for women to resent men, or feel stirred up and resentful and vindictive, or see men as having taken things away from them.
Watch the Jordan Peterson, Kathy Newman interview. What did you think?
Ooh, my whole body contracted, and I felt so sad for womanhood. I felt disappointed, and I could see how the shadow part of womanhood was acting out. I could see how the collective rage was acting through Kathy Newman. This was just a classical example of feminine manipulation, of the deep shadow. Manipulation, control, abuse. When feminism goes wrong, we allow the collective rage to act out through us. So we see every situation, we see every man, we see every encounter with the lens of the victim, and we're so angry about it, and it's boiling in every woman. It's right under the surface, so she will quickly snap if there's a reason, or if there's an apparent reason, because it's so strong, it hasn't discharged. It's in the collective, and that rage needs to discharge, but it needs easy for women to tap into that collective pool of rage, and it just comes out. I can tap into that rage like this. I know it in myself, and women that say they don't, they're just denying it, because it is in the collective.
I think the fact that that interview has resonated with so many people, that it's been so popular, shows that actually something archetypal was going on in that interaction.
So in that sense, it just highlighted what's there. It's wonderful, because here we really get to look at why is this so important? Why is it so important to listen to a thinker like Jordan Peterson and take it seriously and say, what can we do with it? It's just so obvious that it's needed.
Leading people to believe they are being treated unfairly when they're not is the definition of riling them up, wouldn't you say? So who is trying to rile people up, Kathy? Who here? Who is trying to provoke? Him or you?
Tell us about the lobster.
Well, that's quite a segue. Well, the first chapter.
So let's jump right in. So number one, how do you feel? You've been the man of the moment, and there's no question that right now your star has risen.
Very smart.
I was puzzling over a line in the New Testament, which I've always been curious about because it never sat right with me. The meek shall inherit the earth. What meek so actually means, it's the derivation of a word. It's the translation of a word that meant something more like those who have swords and know how to use them but choose to keep them sheathed will inherit the world. It's like, yes, exactly right, exactly right. Much different than the idea of
quite
meek.
different, quite different.
I read this interesting commentary a little while ago on a statement by Christ in the New Testament, and the statement generally interpreted is that the meek shall inherit the earth, but I was looking up the multiple translations of the word meek, and meek is actually derived from a Greek word, of course, and that word didn't exactly mean meek. It meant something like those who have weapons and the ability to use them, but determined to keep them sheathed will inherit the world. And that means that people who are capable of force, let's say, but decide not to use it, are in the proper moral position.
Let me tell you, the Lord God did not call us to be wimps. You know, the Bible says about Moses being the meekest man on earth. And you talk about Jesus being meek. Well, we had a Greek scholar here this morning. You know something? That word meek in the Greek is a word that is used to describe a military horse. It is a military word that means strength under control.
And that word didn't exactly mean meek. It meant something like people who are capable of force, let's say, but decide not to use it, are in the proper moral position. And
when Jesus talked about the ecclesia, the church, again in Greek society, the ecclesia were the movers and the shakers. They were the people that ruled society.
Nietzsche commented on that a fair bit too. You know, he thought of most morality as cowardice, not because morality itself was cowardice, but because most people who are cowards disguise their cowardice as morality, and they claim that their harmlessness, which is actually a consequence of their fear and inability to be harmful, say, or to be dangerous, is actually a sign of their moral integrity.
Here's a man in evening clothes. How he got it, I don't know. Man, you ought to see him go. Twisting the night away.
That's southern U.S. slang for Jesus Christ, by the way. And the initial overlap isn't a fluke. I mean, I'm sure the animators thought that was funny, and of course it is funny. And the reason I'm speaking of Christianity, of course, is because this movie was created in a culture where Christianity was still reasonably intact, and of course it was fully informed by that. But the underlying mythos is not precisely Christian, even though it's informed by Christian imagery. So there's an injunction here, which is that, you know, if you follow this path, you pick a high goal and you put your heart in it, you know, you commit to it, believe in it. Believe means to love. Believe and be loved. It's the same thing. It means to act out. And that's what the belief means. Like, we think belief means to accept a set of propositions as true. Belief is more like you decide that you're going to act something out. You make a decision and then you act it out, and that's a reflection of your belief. You know, it's you're staking yourself on something. And you can do that with commitment, but you have to believe in order to do that. I guess that's why it's a wish. Do you know? Well, no, because you can't. You can't know. You're bounded by ignorance. You can make your best guess and move forward. This is a symbolic representation of Mother Nature, Father Culture, and the suffering individual. But that's all positive. There's no negative elements there, but that's okay. That's a partial representation, and those things are sacred in some sense because they are representative of an ultimate reality. The sacrificial individual here, the suffering individual, well, that's pretty straightforward. It's like, that's life. That's suffering, that's life. That's what happens to the individual. And so, and everyone is looking at that. It has power, that idea. Well, it's because, you know, culture supports the suffering individual, and culture's nested inside benevolent nature, and that's part of the story of the world. And it's just part of the story we're trying to figure out and make articulate. We've been doing that for thousands of years, trying to make this story articulate. And it's not yet articulate. We're only getting it, and we basically do that now, mostly with movies and stories and fiction and that sort of thing. We still don't have it articulated. I think Jung came closer than anyone else. Jung and Erich Neumann, who was one of his students, came closer than anyone else ever has to actually articulating that, and that's what Jung was trying to do, is to take all these images, archetypal images, instinctual images, and say, well, what do they mean? What do they mean? What do they mean? And he got a long ways on that, although his writing is quite obscure. And it's obscure because, well, how the hell are you going to explain an image like that without being obscure? And you want to take that apart linearly. Jesus, it's just impossible, you know? What is the world about? How should we live in it? Well, that's a partial answer, and it's a culture-bound answer, obviously. But you see archetypal representations like this in many cultures.
I think I've made the case in my biblical lectures that I'm striving for a psychological interpretation at the moment. My experience with the biblical stories is that there are layers of depth in them that are sufficiently profound, perhaps because of the staggering hyperlinking of the text and its association with almost the entire corpus of Western literature, that as you keep digging you find more and more. And so I don't know what to make of the more metaphysical claims, you know, but I'm going to leave it at that because I don't know. It's only speculation. The idea of the resurrected Christ is the idea that you should identify not with that part of yourself that's stagnant and dead and that already knows, but is prone to error. You should identify with that part of yourself that's always stretching beyond what you currently know and has the faith to let go of old certainties so that new patterns of being can be brought into place. And so now that's a purely psychological explanation. And
now, when Jung talked about archetypes, it was never clear what he meant, and I think the reason for that was because the archetype is a very complicated idea and a very complicated phenomena, and you can think about it biologically, and you can think about it socially, and you can think about it as something that the individual participates in creating. So So anyways, we talked about this song last week, and it was a very popular song. It's quite beautiful. In the movie, it's actually sung by like a heavenly choir. That's what it sounds like. So it's got this cathedral. You can imagine people singing it in a cathedral, essentially. And so that's not accidental. It's purposeful. What is about to be shown to you has this divine element, essentially, and that's signified by the choir of voices that sings this song. If you lift up your eyes above the temporal into the transcendent, and so that's what exists in the heavenly world, in the stars. If you pick an ultimate goal, if you pick the right ultimate goal, then, and anyone can do this. That's the other thing. It's democratic. It's anyone can do this. So that's the second proposition. It doesn't matter who you are. You can do this. And so I think that's a reflection of the idea of the divinity of the individual. It's like there's something about each individual that's valuable regardless of their idiosyncrasies. And so they have this potential that they can manifest. And how do you manifest it? Well, you pick the right goal. And what's the right goal? Well, it's high. It's elevated. It's above the mundane. Now, what does that mean? Well, you don't really know. You don't really know. That's why it's signified by a star. And the star is something that glimmers in the night, right? So it's a source of light in the darkness. And so there's a metaphor there. Obviously, there's a metaphor there. And the star is the star that's the star of Hollywood, you know, the person that you emulate. That's part of it, because an ideal it's going to be a human ideal of some sort that you're aiming at. So the ideal human being is the star that you're aiming at. You might say, well, what should you aim at in life? And one answer is, well, why don't you aim at being whatever you could be that would be the best? Now, you don't know what that is exactly, because how do you know? You know, but you could think, well, that would be really good if I could have it. And then you could say, well, can I think of anything better than that? And if the answer is no, then, well, why not go for that?
Now that day is not going to be turned on, just somebody's going to pull the cord or turn the switch and the world is all of a sudden going to be good. It's not how it's going to happen. It's not how Christmas is going to come that way to the world. It comes in the hearts of people. And I'm not talking now about a general spirit of goodwill or anything of the kind, because we all tried that. And it lasts as long as you feel good. It lasts until somebody pushes your button. I'm talking about the divine nature of Jesus being born in us and being formed in us. He is the light of the world, and as that comes into us, there then are two natures, and that's the problem. And God, this wonderful Christmas day that is coming to the nations, and God promised it back in the time of Abraham, and it shall come. And the promise that the light would come in the nations has appeared in Isaiah, it's appeared in the prophecies in the book of Luke and so on. Is coming a light to the nations. And that light is only one. It is Christ. It is not our idea about Christ. It is not the teachings of Christ. Men take the teachings of Christ and use them to build kingdoms with. It is Christ himself. Christ, the life of God, the light of God, the power of God, the person. It is Christ, the flesh and bone man, Christ, who is the light and the only light that has the authority and the power and the wisdom and the knowledge to change people and nations so that they know what to do, so that they end up in love, joy, and peace. I cannot impress upon you too strongly. It is not any church that's going to do anything. It is not any denomination that is going to do anything. It is not any philosophy, any knowledge, any well-intentioned people, any system of theology, any liturgy, nothing is going to do to come against the self-will of man, the lure of the world, and the lust of Satan. These things that come out from man are helpless. They may, in a limited sphere, do a short-term good, and then the next generation blows it all apart. It cannot be done, and until we realize that, we spend our lives hoping against hope that somehow there's a solution. Brother, sister, there is no solution to life except Jesus. I'm talking about people that are willing to meet the man today and say, Jesus, you have my life. It's over. You have it. Brother, sister, apart from that, we are still part of the problem and not part of the solution. The solution does not come until, see, Jesus is waiting until his enemies be made his footstool. He's not visible to the world. We are visible to the world. We have his teachings. We have the record of his birth. But the world goes on in its drunken fury. It doesn't change. Did Jesus have to suffer? What if he didn't suffer? Why did he have to suffer? I mean, he's a follower of Christmas, the author of it, the source of it. Why did he have to suffer? Oh, for me, so that I won't have to suffer. Oh, that's not true. That's not true. He suffered because without that suffering, it was impossible for God to move among men and to bring them love, joy, and peace. And we are called to fill up that which is behind of the sufferings of Christ. We're called to do that, or Christmas can never come to mankind. It can never come. We can have the best intentions of the world and sit up in heaven with a gold crown on our head, but it will never come to man that way. It has to come through human beings. I will give him the morning star. I will give him the light of the day of the Lord. I'm not going to just shine it down from heaven. I'm going to send people. I'm going to send people, and in those people will be the new day. That's what's coming. A kingdom is coming. A kingdom, a royal priesthood. Kings of God, priests of God, who have laid down their lives so that the light, the only light of the world, might be formed in them. Formed in them. It can't just dwell in you, it has to be formed in you. You want to do some good to mankind? This is the way. You want to bring Christmas to a crazy, drunken world? This is the way. God gives the overcomer the morning star. That is where the day is coming from. That is where Christmas Day is coming from. It's coming from people who have laid down their lives so with the power and the life and the intelligence of God might be born in them. So in him was light. Light. That light touches your mind. It touches your will. It directs you. That's the new covenant. It's not of the letter. It's of the Spirit. And it changes us. The only thing in the world that will change us. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. It means that the light of this world cannot grasp the light of Jesus. You can explain to your cross-eyed to people about that. They cannot understand it. They cannot grasp it. They cannot comprehend it. They cannot overcome it. They cannot relate to it. They cannot figure it out. It makes no sense. But to the person that God calls, that life of Jesus makes all the sense in the world. And they wake up and they say, aha, that's the meaning of life. That's what it's all about. There is no other light that can come into a man and give him the understanding, the meaning of life. And life is relationships. That's what life is. Otherwise, you're just spinning around. Life is relationship. If you talk and there's nobody to hear, then have you said anything? Isaiah 14, verse 12. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning. See, and this is not Jesus. This is not Jesus. This is the other morning star. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. See, Satan also has a light. He has a kingdom. He has a way and a truth and a life. Satan does. And our life is choosing between the two. Luke 2:32. And this is what Jesus is. A light of revelation to the Gentiles here. It means the nations. He is a light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. You see the difference there. To us, he is the glory of God. To the nations who see the glory of God in us, he is light. He is understanding. Oh, this is why I was born. This is where it's going. This is the true kingdom. We're seekers of the light. To guide our feet into the way of peace. Satan guides our feet into the way of unrest. He also is a day star. He also has a message. He also has something for us. And the end of it is not peace. It is not love. It is lust. It is not joy. It is fun and madness. And it is not peace. It is unrest. It is an insatiable, burning appetite that can never be satisfied. It can never, the satanic things can never be satisfied. He who steals will steal again. He who rapes will rape again. He who destroys a child will destroy again. There's a burning madness that comes with Satan's way. And yet, whether it be cocaine or crystal or whatever it be, always it's never enough. It's addictive. Satan's ways are addictive.
The spirit of Antichrist is teaching us to emulate such things as political leaders, movie actors, great philosophers, or anyone having standing and strength in this world. And Antichrist is exalting heralds declaring an invitation to mankind to pursue and to activate metaphysical principles in the acquisition of temporal things. Even secular academics touching the hot iron of metaphysics are rising into prominence, facilitated by man's inner desire for something transcendent, suggesting, and not without some basis, that the spiritual resources of heaven are becoming available to them, that it makes no difference who they are, that anything their heart desires is attainable by the divinity innately within them, which is a lie. There are many great performers, communicators, politicians, business people, and so on, that ascribe to this occult metaphysics, even though they might know it by different names. Is there light in these teachings? There is, but it is a light that shall end in destruction. Sparks that shall cause them to lie down in torment at such time when those words are fulfilled, as a dream when one awaketh. So, O Lord, when thou awakest, thou shalt despise their image. And there are just two images, that which God accepts and that which is merely an idol, something falsely erected at a time and place that God would have communicated his own holy image to the man. Therefore, Isaiah prophesies concerning those who construct a false image. He feeds on ashes. A deceived heart has turned him aside, that he cannot deliver his soul, nor say, is there not a lie in my right hand? The right hand is a symbol of sanctification by the Spirit. It is also a symbol for Jesus Christ, the righteous right hand of God, who declares to those whom he would sanctify, fear not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. Yes, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. For I, the Lord thy God, will hold thy right hand, saying unto thee, fear not, I will help thee. We may have Christ as the image of God to deliver us, or we may occupy ourselves with some idol of our choosing. We may behold the star that God has set, transcendent in the heaven, or we may behold the alternative day star, who calls us unto an image that is destined for destruction. We may behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world, or we may behold an image of one strong in the earth, but hopelessly indebted to God. Two alternative day stars.
When you wish upon a star.
Peter wishes on a star. Right? And what it means is he lifts up his eyes beyond the horizon to something transcendent, to something ultimate, because that's what a star is. It's part of the eternity of the night sky.
Makes no difference who you are.
And so he lifts his eyes up above his daily concerns and he says, what I want.
Anything your heart desires.
What
will come to you.
To get rid of your goddamn strings.
If your heart is in your dream.
Liar. The other is to be a neurotic victim.
No request is too extreme.
What I want.
When you wish upon a star, as dreamers do.
And so the trick is to get rid of your goddamn strings. And what I want more than anything else is that my creation will become a genuine individual, right? So unlikely. And that catalyzes the puppet's transformation into a real being.
Like a boat out of the blue.
And you remember in Pinocchio, he faces a lot of temptations.
Fate steps in and sees you through.
What?
When you wish upon a star.
We start as puppets.
Your dreams come.
Well, okay, so what you do is you lift up your eyes and